My question is for the authors of A Throne of Swans, Katherine and Elizabeth Corr, and it is, how did you make sure that your writing sounded as if it was coming from the perspective of one person instead of two?
Hi there, so our question is, how do we make sure our writing sounds the same and that it's seamless even though there are two people writing it? Which is a great question, so thanks to whoever sent that in. I think really what we do is we rewrite, well, first of all, we have very similar writing styles, or quite similar writing styles, because we read a lot of the same books as we grew up, and we read a lot of the same books now.
But we have our own definite and distinct strengths and weaknesses. I love writing dialogue, and I love all the humorous parts, the funny parts, and saving people. And
I like killing people,
yes,
and writing descriptive things and doing lots of research. But really, we end up rewriting a lot of each other's work. So generally, one of us will draft a chapter, and then the other one will rewrite that.
So it's rewritten and rewritten and rewritten.
And then the other one will go over that one again. So we just rewrite a lot of each other's work until basically we're happy with the end result, which is how we end up with one single voice. Thanks again for the question.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question for Simon James Green. If Netflix called you and asked you to put together the perfect cast for Alice in Wonderland, who would you choose and where would you film it?
Okay, well, if Netflix called me about Alice in Wonderland, which they will, fingers crossed, right? Fingers crossed. I would probably want to cast somebody maybe like Dylan Llewellyn, who plays James in Derry Girls. Either him or maybe Asa Butterfield, but a slightly younger version. I think would be really good to play Alex. So either of those two. And where would I film it? Well, it's meant to be a seaside town, probably on the sort of South Kent coast, that kind of way. So I'm going to go for somewhere like Margate as the filming location for Alice in Wonderland. Hooray! Let's hope it happens!
My question is for Bex Hogan, and it's, did you learn anything new about yourself after you finished writing your book?
So one of you lovely people sent a question for me, and the question was, did you learn anything new about yourself after you finished writing this book? This is such a good question, and the interesting thing that I want to kind of share with you is that as a writer, you don't tend to finish the book just once. So obviously you finish your first draft for the first time, and when I first wrote Viper, my very first draft was written about 7 years ago. And at that point, it was a very different book. And I think the thing I learned about myself when I finished writing that draft is just that I could complete a book. I could write 80, 90,000 words coherently strung together. And that was quite the achievement. That book I then self-edited several times before I queried it to agents. And although I had a lot of interest, I ultimately didn't get any representation. So what I had to do at that point was completely dismantle the entire book. I started from scratch. I rebuilt from the ground up, completely switched things around, took things out, added new things in. And I think what I learned about myself in that process was that I was able to take something that I loved, something that I had worked really hard on, and completely let go of it, completely forget about it almost, and start again and put all that hard work in again, knowing that there may be no reward at the end for it still, but because I wanted to, because I loved it. And although since then I've worked on the book many, many times, so that version did get me an agent and then ultimately got me my book deal, and that's what the book that you know as Viper. And I've done edits many times on it with my editor, which I think like 3 more times I worked on it and had another finished version. But it was that version that I think taught me the most about myself. That early version where I worked again from the ground up, and it taught me that I had the grit and determination that was required to pursue the dream that I loved and keep putting in the hard work.
Question for Holly Jackson, author of A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. What I wanted to know is, who did you write this book for? It's a book that appeals to so many people. For instance, my 77-year-old grandfather, who lives in Great Missenden, read your book in one afternoon, and he loved it almost as much as I did. But we wondered, why did you set the story in a fictional town and not a real one?
Just a couple of short questions. The first being, who did you write this book for? And I guess the simple answer would be me, but not as in I wrote it for me, even though I did. I wrote it because I wanted to be an author, so I was writing it for me. But I wrote it with the ideal audience in mind, and it would have been kind of me, or a teenage me, kind of like age 15, kind of book that I would really have loved to have had around the time, that I could have got obsessed with and kind of read at the same time as my friends. And that's kind of the person I kept in mind whilst reading, is what kind of book I would really like to have read and still read now, because I think a lot of YA does cross over to people who are in their 20s, who are still young at heart and hate being a grown-up. So yeah, I'd say kind of the young version of me, but then in an extension to that, everyone who just really likes a compelling story that has, you know, lots and lots of plot twists that you don't necessarily expect. That's the kind of reader that I had in mind, the one who would appreciate me kind of meddling with and manipulating them, and they'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, I see what you did there. I wrote it for you. And so the second question, which is, why did you set the story in a fictional town and not a real one? And this one is interesting because originally it was set in a real town, and it kind of still is. It's set in Great Missenden in Buckinghamshire, which is where I lived for a while. And if you look at the map of Little Kilton in the book, you can see it's basically the same as Great Missenden in real life. I might have moved a few things around where I needed them to be, but it's basically the same place, and you know it's the same in all other ways, just not in name. And the reason we renamed it was, I think it was a conversation with my publisher, who we discussed the fact that Great Missenden didn't necessarily come across very well in the book, and that people might not appreciate that that I'd made them look so terrible. Not that any of the book is real. I just borrowed the setting of Great Missenden. Nothing. I don't think there's even been a murder in Great Missenden. It's very quiet. But we were thinking that they might be a bit annoyed by the fact that I made them all look horrible and terrible people. So we decided to go with a fictional town, and then that might give me more freedom with anything else that I wanted to do with it. So the answer being, we didn't want to annoy a whole town of people, because I don't think I could fight off an entire town. I'd give it a shot, but don't fancy my chances.
I loved reading the ABA books this year. My question is about dead popular pursuits. What comes first when writing a book? The inspiration for the characters, or the idea of the storyline?
Well, this is a very unfashionable view, but actually the plot for me comes first, because I have to know what's going to happen in the twist, because everything I write has to work towards that moment. And if it's not working towards that moment, then the book becomes flabby. But that's not to say that the characters are super, super important as well. If they're not authentic and believable and people we can really root for, then the book isn't going to work at all. So the answer to my question is storyline comes first, but the characters are a really close second.
My question's for the author of Blood Moon, Lucy. I wanted to know what made you want to write a YA after writing children's books for so long.
So I have the lovely question from a student, which is, how did I go from writing sweet, innocent books like this, Back to School Tortoise, which is a picture book for preschoolers, to this Blood Moon with quite mature themes in it? And the answer is really that I just love writing, and I wrote this in my 20s, and I was working at a children's publishing house where we made lots of picture books. So I was thinking a lot about that form, as in the structure of writing picture books. And there was this little illustration from the illustrator Meryl Eckerman, and she had sent this illustration, and it was just a little character study she'd done with the tortoise holding a little backpack. And I just had the idea that maybe he was like going to school on his first day, and I'd written this story, and then
think it was actually my friend who I was working with at the time. She was the art director of this book. She's a beautiful designer. And she said, what about if he's the teacher? And then that kind of gave it the whole twist. If you haven't read it, it's a masterpiece. But then I went on an MA, which is a arts master's, and I was just experimenting with lots of different things, writing longer stuff, shorter stuff for older readers. And I did in particular want to write for teenagers, because that's such a formative time of your life, and it was such a big part of my life. And there was a lot there that I felt I hadn't read about. There's a lot that happened to me when I was a teenager that I felt I hadn't seen in books, and wanted to explore some of that. And so that's where Blood Moon came from. Wanted to write very directly about periods. I felt that although there were lots of incidental periods in books, I had felt a lot of shame about my period when I was younger. And so I wanted to just kind of put it out in the open, talk about it, and make it maybe a bit easier for the next generation to talk about. So that's how I moved from one to the other. Thank you for your question.
Is there a sequel to Good Girls Die First?
Thanks for the question. No, unfortunately, Good Girls Die First doesn't have a sequel because I felt like I told all of the characters' stories and killed off a few of them in the first book. However, I would like to write a prequel one of these days, all about the fire that closed the book 20 years ago. And if you're interested in books about teenagers facing down potentially supernatural killers, then please check out It's Behind You, which is my new book that came out just yesterday.
Will you write any more books about overlooked characters in folklore?
So the brilliant question I got given was, will you write any more books about overlooked characters in folklore? Thank you so much to the student who sent me that question. And the answer is absolutely. All of my books in one way or another are responses to silences, whether that's in history or in myths or in stories. I'm always interested in those characters who are often overlooked and often sidelined in favour of more powerful, more glamorous characters. And I absolutely adore really delving into those characters' backstory and thinking what happened to them before they arrived on these pages or into this story. Where did they come from? What made them the way that they are? And one idea that I'm sort of playing around with and have been for a couple of years is writing about Selkies, who are seal women who are cursed to live in the bodies of seals and who become often trapped on land by people who steal their seal skins. So that's probably going to be my next book that responds to a particular unheard voice in folklore, these women who have been objects of curiosity and desire in history but not really had their own stories told.
I have a question for the author of Midnight Twins, Holly Race. My question is, how did you come up with the unique names that appear in the dream world?
Hi there, my name is Holly Race and I'm the author of Midnight's Twins and its sequel, A Gathering Midnight, and I have been asked a question, which is, how did you come up with the unique names that appear in the dream world? Now the short answer to that is, I stole most of them from mythology and from very, very old poems. So we've got the Morrigans, which in Midnight's Twins are a kind of bird bat-like creature that feeds on emotions and memories. Now they are named after the Irish goddess of war and fate from Irish mythology, who appears most commonly as a crow, which is kind of reminiscent of the way that the Morrigans look in Midnight's Twins. Then we've got Annwn, which is the name of my dream world, and that is also the name of the afterlife in Old Welsh mythology. We've got Andraste, who is a goddess in Midnight's Twins and A Gathering Midnight, and she is a warrior goddess in Celtic mythology. Inspire, which is the name of the kind of material that creates Annwn. That was taken from an old Welsh dictionary that I found somewhere online. Then some of the other characters are taken or based on characters from The Fairy Queen, which is an epic poem by Edmund Spenser that Midnight's Twins is very loosely based on. So Phoebe, who's quite a big character in Midnight's Twins, who Fern meets in the dream world, is based on Belle Phoebe, who is a kind of warrior queen type character in the Fairy Queen. And then, yeah, really the only word that I can really claim as my own was Imral, which is the name of the power that Fern and Ollie share, and that the villain of the book has as well. And that was really created from taking the words immoral and immortal and smushing them together and trying to make them feel a little bit more Gaelic, I suppose, that they're more in keeping with the rest of the vocabulary, so they sound a little bit more Celtic, Irish, Welsh mythology type. And yeah, so that's kind of the way that I came up with my vocabulary. I took a lot of it from the lore that kind of runs through the whole book, so I hope that that helped to make it all feel quite coherent and cohesive as a world. I hope that's helpful and interesting. Thank you very much for asking me the question. Bye.